let's get a show of hands. How many of you are the person at work wearing all of the hats? Okay, fair number of you. And how many of you consider yourself a generalist or a hybrid? All right, good. Got a lot of you, wow. Excellent. So tonight we'll be sharing our personal experiences navigating tech as hybrids. And when we met, we really connected over that. It can be kind of hard to find other hybrids out there. So we hope that after this talk tonight, you'll walk away having made some kind of connection with somebody else here, and also have some strategies to utilize to further your own careers. So, can you introduce yourself, everybody?
All right. First off, can everyone hear me? Am I speaking loudly enough? All right. My name is Zoraida. And to be honest, I am pretty new to the tech world. I worked a couple of years in museums as an art educator or museum art educator, and I work in customer support for a couple of years. And then, being in these fields, I discovered a lot of problems in the technologies in all the organizations I was working on, and I kind of became interested in figuring out how I could make things better. And at first, I thought I wanted to be a front-end engineer. So I started studying computer science and building websites, but I was missing that part where I was talking to the people who were using things and figuring out does this work for them. So I became interested in UX. But while I was looking for kind of my first couple of UX roles, I was a little worried that I was going to give up coding and working with JavaScript or CSS. And then luckily enough, I found an internship at Harvard Web Publishing, which is actually a department that works with a couple of different websites and web apps in Harvard, and the designers also do CSS, and they were looking to expand their research capabilities. So when I came in, I started doing a lot of research, and I was doing design and a little bit of CSS, so I became even more of a generalist than I was before. And they thought I was pretty good at the research part, so they ended up hiring me as a UX designer researcher. And what that title doesn't really tell you is that I'm still doing CSS, so wearing multiple hats. Katie, what about you?
So I really struggled to condense my background into like a nice, concise story for you tonight. And I think that's a struggle that a lot of generalists have when they try to talk about what they do for work. There's just so many aspects of things. It can be hard to kind of sell yourself. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later tonight. But to keep it brief, my background is in graphic design, but I also grew up tinkering with HTML and CSS. I just never really thought it would turn into a career for me. I was the girl building MySpace layouts in high school, like selling them to people. That's how I taught myself. After I graduated, I took on some freelance clients like Veggie Galaxy and Savinor's Market. And small businesses like that, they really want you to kind of wear all the hats. So they were like, you can build us a website too, like not just signage and marketing. I was like, yeah, totally, I can definitely do that. I didn't know how to do that though. So I had to kind of teach myself that at the time. Whoops. So I'm primarily self-taught, but after a few years of freelancing, I landed my first real front-end developer role at a startup where I was able to really hone in on my engineering skills. And now I'm a UI UX engineer at CarGurus, where I spent 2 years kind of navigating whatever UI UX engineer means and finding the gaps between engineering and design. And now I'm kind of starting to move more into our style guide and design system work.
All right, so what are we talking about today? Brad Frost has this metaphor to describe the work of generalists. He talks about the brick and mortar, and he calls the specialists the bricks, and then generalists are the mortar that holds together those bricks. We want to think about this in kind of CSS terms. So if we think about it, it's kind of like the generalists are the space between, or perhaps the gap in the grid layout. We are that nice white space that divides the content into columns and rows, but we also keep the layout together. And I see some smiles, so I think some of you get this, but Katie and I went back and forth with this metaphor a lot. So to be more specific, what we're talking about is kind of the unconventional space that the generalist holds within an organization, because of the variety of skills that we have. We end up kind of being in a place where no one really knows where to put us. It's not really clear where in the organization we stand. So what ends up happening is that we end up finding kind of the gaps in organizational needs or organizational goals and filling those gaps. And until larger companies start hiring more for generalists, we're gonna keep finding those gaps and keep trying to figure out where we stand. But before we can even sell ourselves to any company, we need to understand the value that we have for those companies. So that's what we're talking about today.
So we're focusing on generalists tonight, but specialists are equally as important to an org. We need generalists to think about the big picture just as much as we need specialists to be detailed and focused with their work. So accepting yourself as a generalist can be a little bit scary because you don't have like one expert that you can, or one expertise that you can rely on when you're networking with people and interviewing for roles. But understanding the value that you bring to the table will help you feel more comfortable and confident as a generalist, and also encourage other people to start filling those gaps. It's time for another poll of the audience. So raise your hand if you've interviewed for a design role and were told that you were not going to be able to code your own designs. I have. What about the opposite? What about an engineering role where you were told you're not going to be able to do any design work at all? We got two hands from one person. Wow. Yes. So I think both scenarios are very common and oftentimes occur because it's easier to hire for a specific role than a cross-functional role. I'm sure we've all heard this argument before that you can't be good at everything, so just pick one and become an expert. But we don't really feel like that's a very productive argument to make. So I think we should focus less on whether someone is an expert in this context and more on how adaptive they can be with their skill set. If you have a broad skill set, you can control where you spend your energy. So let's reframe this mental model to be something more like you're leaning in on specific skills when and where you need to, but always keeping them in your back pocket when you're not using them. There's no reason you can't learn what you need to when you need to. This happens in engineering all the time. If you have a specific need or a problem you need to solve, what do? You look it up and you figure out how to solve that problem, and then maybe you'll use that again in the future, maybe you won't. But if you want to accomplish a specific goal, you spend time researching to get there. Also, you're not alone as a generalist.
There's the sense that generalists are unicorns, but we don't really believe in this term because as a generalist, you're not alone. There's many of us with multiple skills out there, with multiple interests who fall, again, in between everything. So we're not mythical creatures. We're actual contributors to code bases, design decisions. And we're giving talks about design and engineering and the connection between those things. And I'm not just talking about Katie and I. Like, there's other people who talk about this topic, and one of my favorites is Natalya Shelbourne, who some of you might know from a recent talk she did here at Boston CSS, where she talked about CSS in the intersection. And for those of you who don't know much about Natalya, she's a front-end engineer for the New York Times, where she works with React mostly, but she also works a lot with CSS. And before she became an engineer, she was actually an artist, and she was an art educator, and she also worked as a designer. And she gives a lot of talks about bridging engineering and design. And one of my favorite talks is where she talks about how she created a program that uses SAS to create a cohesive color palette. And the purpose of the program wasn't so much to create a color palette. There's a lot of color pickers out there, but it was actually to demonstrate how developers can use programming principles, mathematical principles, and design concepts to develop a cohesive design. So if you're wondering where do I fit as a generalist, there's a couple of places for you.
So it wouldn't be a talk about hybrids and generalists if we didn't talk about design systems a little bit. It's a pretty hot topic right now, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. But if you're not familiar with design systems, they establish the foundation for product design and development, and they promote design and technical consistency across the org. So design system teams are cross-functional in nature, as you can see here. The system needs perspectives from experts across the org, and there's no system without collaboration between those organizations like design, development, content, brand, you name it. You can really, this kind of will depend on your org structure, but this is a baseline. Hybrid developer types can fulfill many of the team's needs, which is why it's a great place for them to be in an org. Some characteristics of generalists that work well in design systems are that you're a big picture thinker and a systems thinker, and you've also spent time on the ground. So you know what the engineers and what the designers are dealing with, but you also can kind of take a step back and see the bigger picture as a whole. You should have excellent communication skills because you have the design perspective and the developer perspective. You can clearly communicate the value of both sides. And generally, you should have extensive knowledge of HTML, CSS with working JS knowledge. That's kind of common among hybrid roles on design system teams. So earlier we took a poll about your interview experiences, and some of you raised your hand for being an engineer who was told they can't design, or two hands. Most commonly, people ask, should designers code? Kind of a hot topic on design Twitter. But should engineers design? I think it's a lot easier to talk about designers learning to code than it is engineers learning to design. For many of us who have a design background, it kind of feels like an innate skill that nobody else can really fully understand. But we're arguing that everybody is creative to some degree, and the principles that we learn as designers are the same that a not as creative person would learn if they wanted to learn design.
So I think one of the reasons we fall into this trap of thinking that design is something people can't understand is because we tend to interchange design with art, and we therefore tend to associate design with this kind of natural artistic ability. But there's quite a few arguments out there about how design and art are completely different fields. And I have a background in art history, so I can talk hours about this. But I'm going to pick one specific argument and tell you about how one of the theories is that, well, art is kind of this innate thing, something that we're born with. When we think of an artist, we think of someone we admire because they have this like specialized skill, or not skill, that's not the word I'm looking for, this specialized talent that it's hard to imitate. But design, on the other hand, is a skill. Design is something that is made of learnable principles. And that's not to say that design is easy. Design is difficult, but you can say the same thing about engineering. Engineering is difficult. That doesn't mean that you can't learn it. So we can think of design like a skill, such as engineering.
So we've talked about why being a generalist is a strength, but in some cases, it's a role that you might need to advocate for. In my case, I took a job title that I don't fully identify with. That the word engineer is kind of intimidating to me. But I took it because I felt like I had the space to grow and figure out what I wanted to do, and I was going to be around people that would be cool with that. I think it would take us all night if we wanted to survey the room for front-end related job titles, because there's so many out there, so we're not going to do that, don't worry. But we are going to talk about why some reasons why we don't think your job title really matters all that much other than on paper. If you're able to land a job title that very clearly describes what you do as a generalist, that's awesome.
Yeah, I sure don't have that title. And I don't think Katie does either.
I don't know what that would feel like. It must feel great. But if you're like us and maybe kind of have a title that you don't fully identify with, I like to use this strategy. I will kind of tailor what I tell people I do depending on who I'm speaking to. And I think we do this all the time, like with your hairdresser, you know, you're not going to be like, I'm a UI UX product designer, engineer. They're like, what is that? You're like, I'm a web designer. That's fine. And they understand that. They can kind of get where you're coming from, even though you're not a web designer. So for me, if I'm speaking to a designer, as someone who has a design background, I'll probably say something like, I'm an engineer with a background in design, or I'm a designer who codes, because that way they kind of know that we're on the same playing field and we can talk about design a little bit and I'll understand what they're saying. But if I'm talking to an engineer, I'll probably stick with my UI UX engineer title because I want them to know, like, we can talk about React. That's totally fine. Like, let's talk about React. I'm cool with that. But that said, I do feel like generalists should start to push for more specific job titles, so that companies will start hiring more generalists, and then we can normalize it a bit and get HR to buy into it, and then get some data out there about what are those salaries like, what are the expectations of those roles, where do you sit in the org. So some of these titles do exist and have for a while, but they aren't really as normalized as other titles. One of these titles is design technologist. Design technologists have the skills of a great designer and great engineer. They have advanced knowledge of one or more technical languages, but are also strong in UX and visual design. They tend to think systematically, but also have an eye for balance and hierarchy. And sometimes they reside on design ops teams and help create the handoff process between design and development. Very often, you'll see design technologist roles on design system teams if you're interested in looking in that. And I would strongly recommend, if you identify with any of those things I just said, looking up these job descriptions, because even if you're not looking for a new role right now, just reading those job descriptions will give you some new words and verbiage to kind of that you can use to describe yourself if you start identifying with those things. So you can use that when you're just networking with people at meetups or when you are eventually looking for a new role.
Okay, this all sounds great, but what if you're brand new to this? To take a poll, again, who here is looking for their first tech job or one of the initials? Yeah, it's pretty common in meetups, so don't feel shy. But also, who here is not necessarily looking for their first job, tech job, but applying to jobs and maybe applying to a lot of different titles, not just one? Yeah. Well, I was in a similar place pretty recently, actually. I was looking for my first full-time tech position, and I was an UX design intern, but I was also freelancing as a web developer for a tiny nonprofit. And in the meantime, I was applying to all these different titles: UX designer, UX UI engineer, UX designer researcher. I think I had applied to an actual UX researcher job at one point. And in the meantime, I was getting this question: what part of UX do you want to go into? So I would literally go to conferences or job fairs and start talking to people, and we'd had this lovely conversation, and then I'd say, oh, are you hiring for your UX team? And they would go, yes. What do you want to do specifically? And it was a really hard question for me to answer every single time. It was really frustrating because I like to code, I like to design, and I was doing research and I wanted to keep exploring that side. So then the other frustrating part about that was that I was talking to senior designers and asking, what should I be doing as someone who's just brand new to this? And they would say, you should be learning as much as possible. You shouldn't be focusing on specializing just yet. And this sounded really contradictory to me. So what was I supposed to do? What should you do if you're just starting out? So here's what you need to do. You need to do two things. Apply for that specialized job. And then the second thing is figure out what is not on that job description. What are the gaps in the organization? And specifically what this means is if you are applying for jobs, have multiple resumes, and customize them. I had, I think, 3 or 4 resumes that I customized slightly, and the same went for cover letters. And I customized them depending on the role, and I followed whatever was on the job description. But you shouldn't just stay there. You need to research the company, go to meetups, do informational interviews, and really ask those probing questions that will tell you what is not on the job description. And this is something that applies not just if you're starting out. It's pretty important if you're just starting out, but it should apply to you as a generalist in general.
So some more specific things to look for, let's say you're actually at the point of interviewing for a role now. Some things to look for as a generalist are, what does the org structure look like? We talked about how you probably won't be on one team or the other, but you want to know what team you would be on and who you'd be sitting with every day, because that will kind of dictate if you're going to be sitting with engineering, maybe you'll be doing more engineering than design, unless those two teams collaborate all the time. These are questions that you kind of need to get at while you're interviewing. Also, interviewing as a generalist for a specialized role, you need to make sure you understand what the expectations are for what they're hiring for. A lot of times in engineering, specifically, they're looking for a JavaScript engineer because they have a specific need that they need filled. Or like a specific project, they just want a JavaScript engineer. They don't care if you really like CSS, and they don't care if you like design. And you need to know that ahead of time, because that's probably not going to be a great role for you as a generalist. You're going to feel a little bit stuck in that role. But other times, if they're just generally hiring for a front-end dev person, and you say the word hybrid and they don't freak out, that's a good sign. That means that they're going to be open to you exploring and trying new things.
Yeah. So, what are some specific questions that you can ask? Well, think again about CSS in the intersection and ask, how's your CSS like? Or what do you need in terms of your CSS? There's usually a lot of CSS depth in the company, and they usually need someone to come in and make it maintainable. So that's a good question to ask if you're interested in doing that type of work. Another one might be, what are your needs in terms of accessibility? Accessibility, if you're interested in it, is actually a really great place for someone with multiple hats or multiple interests, because it kind of requires that curiosity of a researcher and then that eye for design or understanding for design and usability of a designer. And it also requires some knowledge of code and how to structure things. So you can be a pretty good advisor if you're kind of in between and have a specialization in accessibility.
So if you're not currently searching for a job, you can still find gaps within your current organization. So let's look at this from a perspective of a traditional org split between engineering and design. Depending on the company, you might have a hard time being placed between these orgs, like I said earlier. So it's more likely that you'll be on one or the other. But with your natural tendency to ask big picture questions, you'll likely start communicating with both orgs anyways, so it shouldn't matter too much. And you should really start those conversations as soon as you start the job. Set up one-on-ones with people on design and engineering, depending on which side you're on, and make sure that they understand the skill set that you have and the value that you're bringing. because the more people that are aware of that, the more likely it is you'll be able to actually utilize those skills. So in my experience, I took a role that wasn't like the perfect fit for me, but I was relentless in talking to my JavaScript engineer manager about design, who had no clue what I was talking about ever. And that was a few managers ago, but because I did that, it went up the chain. So he would tell his boss that I keep talking about design. What does this mean? Why is she doing this? And eventually it got to somebody who was like, oh, we have this project. We're redesigning our homepage and we need to build a whole component library out of that project. Katie would be a good fit for that. So I was able to land that because I was just kind of pushing since day one of starting the role. And now I'm actually turning that style guide into a design system. So I think the key takeaway here is to not feel limited by your job title, to start looking for those gaps to fill. And communicating your ideas to the right people is the key to filling those gaps.
So we've talked quite a bit about the gap between design and engineering, but there's other generalist roles out there, and one of those is designer and researcher. And to give a little bit of context about why I'm talking about this, unlike Katie, I actually fell into the kind of role that was pretty open from the start. So the reason for that was I started at Harvard Web Publishing as an intern, and I was their first UX design intern, so they were kind of like, we don't really know what to do with you, but we have all this research, can you help with that? And then I started talking to my manager and saying, oh, I actually do CSS and I want to do a bit more design. And they were really open to kind of structuring things because, again, they weren't really sure what that internship was going to develop into. And then eventually they hired me as a designer researcher, but because they knew I had these other skills, they've kind of been trying to accommodate those interests as well. And I've had opportunities to learn about some of the things that they're doing in terms of CSS in the workplace. So all this is to preface that I kind of had this intention of doing design and engineering at first, but I discovered that a researcher is also a skill that I was interested in, something that I wanted to do as well. And when we talk about the gap between design and research, some of you might argue, well, there's not too much of an argument there sometimes. Sometimes there's a lot of designers who do research. But as UX kind of matures, we are starting to see that there's a lot of more companies kind of having researcher-specific jobs, and then there's companies who are having kind of the umbrella product designer term for both a researcher and a designer, but then there's other companies who just have the product designer and the user researcher. They're different things. So it's starting to get a little bit more, there's a bit more variety and a little bit more argument that maybe designers shouldn't be doing research or researchers shouldn't be doing design. But the reality, if you're in either of these roles, is that you will notice that it really depends on your organization or where you are. So to give a concrete example, in my organization, it helps that I am doing both things. So currently, one of the things I'm trying to do is trying to figure out how we can kind of streamline some of our research processes, because it's something that hasn't really been formalized too much. It's something that's been we kind of work on a agency style. It's something that we slowly started introducing to some of our clients, and so we're trying to figure out how to make it better. And I wasn't sure what that meant. So the first thing I started doing was talking to people on my team. Like, okay, I have some ideas about this, but I don't want to go with these assumptions. I want to know what other people are thinking. And something that really resonated with me was one of my teammates actually mentioned, yeah, we're doing all this great research, but we're not necessarily linking it to design. They still seem these two very separate things, and we're not always clear what our findings mean in terms of research. And I wish I had an answer for you about how we're going to solve this, but I don't. But what I want to tell you is that it's good that I discovered that. And the first thing that you have to do when you're a generalist is understand your team and understand what that team needs. Okay, so now you have learned a lot about your value as a generalist. Hopefully you're pretty excited about that. Let's talk about how you can meet other people who can invest in your career, or who you can invest in.
So, the good news is you're at Boston CSS meetup right now, which is a great place to meet other hybrids. But we put together a few other resources that we have. So, other meetups in Boston, I have to mention Ladies at UX Boston because I co-organized that with Lara and Olga back there. Our meetups are a little bit more focused on design, but it's a great place to go if you are interested in design and you want to meet some more designers. Also, if you can make it to a conference, Clarity Conference is all about design systems. I haven't been personally, but I've heard, it sounds pretty magical, really. If it's just like all people interested in design systems, probably a lot of hybrids there. Smashing Conference I have been to. Has anybody else been to Smashing? I thought it was incredible, and the people there were very much hybrids, and I felt like, oh, there's other people out there. So if you can make it to a conference, that can be a really good way to meet other people as well. If you can't, Design Systems Slack is the Slack that kind of goes along with Clarity Conference. It's a very active Slack community, and it's not just about design. A lot of it is about design systems, but it's a good place to get to meet other hybrids and just talk about code or design or Figma or Sketch, or really, there's a lot of channels. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. And then we put 2 podcasts up here. I listen to a lot of podcasts, so it was very hard to pick 2. But Design Details, they're both interview podcasts primarily. And Design Details, they just had an episode last week with a generalist that was really interesting to kind of hear another perspective on it. Design Better, also very good interviews.
Yeah.
With
I like it a lot.
all kinds of different people in design.
Yeah, I should also add, Katie and I met at a conference, which I just thought about. I don't know why we didn't include that here, but we met at UXPA Boston. So it's mostly about UX and mostly about research, actually. But Katie was giving a talk on how she is a UX UI engineer, or she was on a panel, and I just went up to her afterwards. So conferences are great. Yeah.
It's a small world.
Yeah.
So yeah, connecting with other hybrids will help you feel less like the odd one out, and hopefully give you some strategies for handling your position within your org, because you can kind of swap stories and learn from each other.
But don't just stick to conferences or meetups. There's people at work who can help you too. So if you are in a team where you're comfortable with the engineers and you want to work with HTML and CSS and you're a designer, find one who you can pitch the idea to and just start chatting, do regular one-on-ones, and see if you can maybe start doing some code, or at least talking about what it is that they need. Just see what happens by talking to them, getting together with them. Talking to people can open up so many ideas about where your career can go.
Absolutely. The same can go for engineering as well. If you're an engineer and you want to be doing more design, set up some one-on-ones with some key people on the design teams, because as much as you need them to kind of get into design at your company, they also need you, because you understand design, but you're also touching the code, and so you can help make sure that their designs actually hit the code and production as they originally had planned.
Yeah. Also, as a pro tip, if you're interested in research, researchers usually like it if there's room and there's the kind of the structure for it, for kind of to have engineers look at or observe interviews or usability tests, because that kind of gives them ideas, that can give the engineers ideas of what they need to improve. So if you're interested in research, that might be a good way to learn about what your research team is doing.
And just to get you started in finding some allies,
well, we're here, so if you want to talk to us, feel free to connect via Twitter, LinkedIn. Those are our Twitter handles, and we'd love to continue this conversation.
So if you're a generalist, you should be feeling really excited right now. There's room for you in the tech world. Your skills are valuable. You should be proud of them. You're not defined by your job title. You should break down those boundaries and find the gaps. And take a look around. You're surrounded, a lot of people, you raised their hand in the beginning, a lot of you are hybrids, so you're surrounded by other people that you should connect with, and hopefully you'll chat after this and make some more connections. So thank you so much.